There are things that happen inside royal palaces that the world is never supposed to know. There are conversations held in marble corridors that no camera captures, no journalist hears, and no official record ever touches. And then, very rarely, there is a moment so unexpected, so raw, so completely out of place in those gilded rooms that even the people trained their entire lives to stay silent cannot stop talking about it. This is one of those moments. And it began with a 6-year-old boy, a crowded room of palace staff, and 6 words that changed the way everyone inside those walls looked at Camilla, the queen consort, forever. The morning had started the way most mornings started at the palace during the Christmas season, with a kind of organized chaos that outsiders would never believe existed behind those famous iron gates. Decorators were moving through the long corridors with ladders and garlands. Kitchen staff were managing deliveries for the upcoming family gathering. Senior household staff were reviewing schedules, seating arrangements, and the endless list of small details that royal events require. It was the kind of morning where everyone had somewhere to be and something to do, and nobody had time for surprises. Among the palace guards stationed that day were men and women who had spent years learning how to be invisible. Not literally, of course, but in the professional sense, they had mastered the art of standing in rooms where history was happening and leaving no trace of themselves behind. They watched. They listened when they had to. They remembered because their job sometimes required it. But they never, ever spoke about what they saw. That was the unspoken agreement that came with the uniform, the position, the trust that the royal family placed in the people who stood closest to them. So when what happened that morning spread through the household the way it did, quickly, quietly, in the careful way that palace gossip moves, in low voices behind closed doors, in glances exchanged across rooms, it said something significant. It said that what happened was not easy to contain. It said that the people who saw it could not entirely process it through their usual professional filters. Something had slipped through the armor that years of royal service builds around a person, and what slipped through was something that made people stop, look at each other, and think, did that just happen? Prince Louis was 6 years old at the time. Those who know the young prince, and those who have watched him in the limited public appearances his parents allow, would describe him as the kind of child who makes rooms feel different simply by being in them. He is energetic in a way that seems almost deliberate, as though he has decided that the world is something to be engaged with rather than observed. He finds humor in places adults have forgotten to look. He is unafraid in that particular way that very young children sometimes are, not reckless, but genuinely unbothered by the weight of expectation that settles on every person the moment they step into a royal environment. His parents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, have worked carefully to give their 3 children something approaching a normal childhood, while simultaneously preparing them for a life that will be anything but normal. The balance they walk is one of the defining challenges of modern royal parenthood, and those who watch them closely say that both William and Catherine approach it with a quiet seriousness that speaks to how much they care about getting it right. The children attend school. They play. They are encouraged to be curious and kind and brave. And they are, within the privacy of family life, allowed to simply be children, which means that sometimes, without warning, they say things that no amount of protocol training could have anticipated. That December morning, Prince Louis found himself in a section of the palace where, strictly speaking, he probably should not have been. This is not unusual for young children in large households. They wander, they explore, they follow their instincts toward whatever seems interesting. A guard stationed in that corridor later described seeing the young prince moving with purpose, the way children do when they are looking for something specific, though they cannot always articulate what it is. He was alone, which was slightly unusual, and he was clearly searching for someone. What he found, instead of whoever he was looking for, was a sitting room where a small gathering of senior household staff had assembled for a brief morning meeting. The door was partially open. Louis stepped inside without hesitation. Again, this is simply how very young children relate to space. They do not yet understand that partially open doors can still mean closed, and he looked around the room with the particular directness that children of his age possess before they learn that looking at people is something adults manage carefully. Several members of staff noticed him immediately. One woman near the door started to speak, to gently redirect him, the way one does with a royal child who has wandered into the wrong room, with warmth, with respect, with the practiced neutrality of someone who knows that any reaction beyond calm helpfulness is inappropriate. But before she could complete her sentence, Louis had already focused on the person in the far corner of the room, and his face had changed in the way children's faces change when they recognize someone they were not expecting to see. Camilla was there. The queen consort had come into that particular sitting room for reasons of her own. A brief conversation, a document to review, the simple fact of palace life meaning that people move through rooms constantly, and their paths cross in ways that are rarely choreographed. She was not holding court. She was not performing any official function. She was simply present in the way that people who live and work in a large shared household are simply present in each other's spaces sometimes. When Louis saw her, he stopped. The staff in the room held a collective, professional breath. The queen consort smiled at him. She is known to be warm with children, genuinely so, not in the performed way of public engagements, but in the quieter way of someone who actually enjoys the company of young people. She said something to him, a greeting, the kind of thing adults say to children they know well. And Louis responded. But what he said was not the kind of response any of the household staff in that room had ever heard before. He looked at her, and then, in the clear, carrying voice of a child who has not yet learned to modulate his volume for social comfort, he said something that made every adult in that room stop breathing entirely. He said, "I know something about you that nobody is supposed to say." There was a silence that those who were present would later struggle to adequately describe. It was not the silence of shock, exactly, though shock was certainly present. It was more the silence of people who are professionals trying very hard to process something through their professional frameworks and finding, for a moment, that those frameworks are insufficient. Camilla herself did not move. Her expression did not change in any dramatic way. She is a woman who has lived through decades of scrutiny and learned, perhaps better than anyone, how to receive unexpected things with composure. But there was something in her eyes, those who were close enough to see would later say, that was not composure. It was something else, something quieter and more complicated. The guard nearest the door later said that his first instinct was to step forward, not because the situation was in any way dangerous, but because years of training had conditioned him to respond to moments of uncertainty with movement, with presence, with the offer of a buffer between something and something else. He did not step forward. None of them did. Because in the next moment, Louis continued speaking, and what he said made stepping forward feel not only unnecessary but somehow wrong, as though interrupting now would mean missing something important. He said it simply, the way children say things that are complicated, without ceremony, without awareness of the weight they carry, with the pure directness of someone for whom words are just words and truth is just truth. He had heard something. He could not have been entirely sure what it meant. He was 6, and there are layers of meaning in adult conversations that 6-year-olds absorb without understanding, the way they absorb language before they understand grammar. But he had heard it, and he had been carrying it. And now, standing in that room, looking at the woman the words were about, he had decided, in the way children decide things, suddenly and completely, that this was the moment to let it go. What he said was this. He had heard adults talking late one evening about Camilla. About something from before, something from a long time ago, before most of the people in his world had been born. Something about a child that some people said existed and other people said never had. A child whose name had drifted through decades of royal speculation the way certain rumors do, surfacing and disappearing, surviving in whispers and in the memories of people old enough to have been paying attention at the right moment. Louis did not know what he was saying, not fully, but every adult in that room knew exactly what he was saying. And the look that passed between the senior members of staff, brief, careful, the particular look of people who have just realized that a secret they thought was contained has been heard by someone very small who is now standing in front of the person that secret is about, said everything that none of them could say out loud. Camilla looked at the boy for a long moment. The room was very still. Outside in the corridor, the ordinary sounds of palace morning continued: footsteps, a distant telephone, the sound of something being moved along a hard floor. Inside the room, none of that registered. There was only the boy and the woman and the 6 words he had said and everything that those 6 words had just opened. And then Camilla did something that none of the staff in that room expected. She did not deflect. She did not laugh it off in the practiced way of royals who have learned to treat awkward moments as non-events. She did not look at the nearest staff member with the particular expression that means, "Please remove this situation immediately." She did something much simpler and in some ways much harder. She leaned forward slightly so that her eyes were closer to his level, And she looked at him, really looked at him, the way adults rarely look at children when they are saying something inconvenient, and she said 2 words in return. Those 2 words, and what came in the moments immediately after, form the heart of this story. But to understand why those 2 words mattered, why they landed the way they did, not just on Louis but on every adult in that room, it is necessary to understand something about the history that the young prince had stumbled into without realizing it. Because what he had overheard was not a small rumor. It was not gossip in the ordinary sense. It was something that went back decades, something rooted in the most complicated chapter of Camilla Parker Bowles's life, long before she became queen consort, long before she became anything to the British royal family other than a name that people whispered with a complicated mix of judgment and pity and fascination. The story begins, as so many complicated stories do, in the early 1970s. Camilla Shand, as she was then, was a young woman moving through London society in the particular way that well-connected young women of that era did. She was witty, she was warm, she was the kind of person who made other people feel comfortable without effort. She was also, by the accounts of those who knew her then, genuinely in love with a young man who was himself in love with her, but whose position in the world made straightforward love a complicated proposition. The young man was Charles, the Prince of Wales, and their story, the arc of it, the long, painful, complicated arc, is now one of the most written-about love stories of the 20th century. But within that story, there is a chapter that has never been fully told. A chapter that surfaced occasionally in biographies, in investigative journalism, in the recollections of people who were close to Camilla during a specific period in the mid-1970s, and then sank again before it could be properly examined. It is the chapter that Louis, without knowing any of this history, without understanding any of the names or the implications, had somehow heard an echo of late one evening, from adults who had forgotten that a child was nearby. The rumors about Camilla and a child that some sources over the decades have suggested existed, conceived during her relationship with Charles before either of their respective marriages, belong to the category of royal speculation that is almost impossible to verify or disprove. The palace has never confirmed anything. Camilla herself has never spoken about it publicly. Charles has never addressed it. The people who might know, the small, tight circle of individuals who were genuinely close to both of them in those years, have maintained a silence that has lasted half a century. But silence, as the people who maintain it know better than anyone, is not the same as absence. And what Louis had walked into that morning, by accident, through a half-open door, was the living, breathing consequence of that half-century of silence. The weight of it sitting in a room with the woman at its center, suddenly faced with the youngest member of her extended family asking her, in the clear, honest voice of a child, whether something was true. What Camilla said in response, and what happened in the hours and days that followed within the household, within the family, and eventually in whispers beyond the palace walls, is a story that requires understanding not just what was said, but what it meant. For Camilla, for William and Catherine when they eventually learned what their youngest child had done. For the senior household staff who were present and who would spend weeks afterward wrestling with what their professional obligations required them to do with what they had witnessed. And for Louis himself, who would carry the memory of that conversation for the rest of his life, without yet having the capacity to fully understand what he had stepped into. The sitting room that morning was ordinary in every way except the conversation happening inside it. Pale winter light came through tall windows. A fire had been laid but not yet lit. Chairs were arranged with the careful neatness that palace interiors always maintain, even in private rooms. Coffee had been brought and was cooling on a side table. It was the kind of room where 1,000 ordinary conversations had happened over many decades, the kind of room that absorbs things without showing them. On this particular morning, it absorbed something that none of its walls had held before. And when Louis eventually left, when a member of staff had quietly, gently guided him back toward the part of the palace where he was supposed to be, the people who remained looked at each other in the specific silence of people who know that what just happened cannot be undone. The words had been said. The question had been asked, and Camilla had answered. The answer, when it was eventually pieced together by the household staff who were present and who spoke to each other in careful fragments over the days that followed, was not what anyone had expected. It was not a denial in the way they had anticipated. It was not a deflection. It was not the smooth, practiced non-answer of someone who has spent a lifetime managing exactly this kind of moment. It was something else, something rower. Something that told the people in that room more about Camilla than anything they had read in a newspaper or heard in any official briefing had ever told them. And it began, all of it, the revelation, the consequence, the long, quiet aftermath, with 2 words from a woman who had spent 50 years carrying something alone. The 2 words Camilla said were, "You're right." Nobody in that room had been prepared for that. Not the senior staff member standing near the window who had spent 11 years in royal household service and believed, by that point, that nothing could genuinely surprise her. Not the guard by the door who had been trained to anticipate threats and had come to understand over time that the most serious threats in royal environments are rarely physical. Not the junior assistant who had been in the room purely by accident, present for a brief errand, and who now found herself locked in a moment that she would replay in her mind for years. None of them had been prepared for the queen consort to look at a 6-year-old boy and say, "You're right." The silence that followed those 2 words was different from the silence that had followed Louis's original statement. The first silence had been the silence of people absorbing a shock. This second silence was something heavier, the silence of people beginning to understand that they were not in the middle of an awkward moment that would resolve itself quickly, but in the middle of something much larger, something with history behind it. Something that had been waiting for a very long time for exactly this kind of crack to open. Louis, to his credit, or perhaps simply to his 6-year-old obliviousness to the enormity of what was happening, did not look frightened by this answer. He looked, if anything, relieved. This is a characteristic of very young children when adults confirm something they have been carrying. They are not overwhelmed by the confirmation because they lack the context to understand why the confirmation is significant. They simply feel the relief of having been told the truth. Louis nodded, in the solemn way children nod when they are processing something serious, and then he asked the next question with the same uncalculated directness he had brought to all of this. He asked, "Where are they?" Camilla looked at him for a moment that the staff in the room would later unanimously describe as the longest moment they had ever witnessed without a clock. It was not a dramatic pause in the theatrical sense. It was a genuine moment of stillness, the kind that comes when a person is deciding something real, not performing deliberation, but actually living inside it. She was deciding. Those who watched her understood whether to continue, whether to go further. Whether the conversation that had begun with a child's blunt honesty deserved a response that matched it in kind, or whether this was the moment to draw back, to reclaim the professional composure that the queen consort was known for, to gently redirect the boy and close the door on this. She chose to continue, and in doing so, she made a decision that would ripple outward from that sitting room into the broader life of the palace household in ways that none of them could have fully anticipated at the time. She told him not everything because there are some things that are not for 6-year-olds, and Camilla, whatever her history, is a woman with wisdom about what children can hold but something. A version, a fragment of truth wrapped in language that a child could receive without it breaking something in him. She told him that there had been, a long time ago, someone who was part of her life, someone she had loved. And that circumstances, the word she used, circumstances, with the particular weight it carries when an adult uses it with a child and means by it. Things that were bigger than any one person's wishes had made it so that things went a different way than she had hoped. Louis listened with the focused attention that children bring to stories they recognize as important even when they do not fully understand them. He did not interrupt. He did not ask for clarification of words he didn't know. He simply listened, in the way children sometimes listen when they understand that this is a moment for listening rather than speaking. When she finished, he said, "That's sad." And Camilla, the queen consort, the woman who has spent the better part of 50 years managing her public image with extraordinary discipline, who has sat in official residences and faced the scrutiny of the world without flinching, who has buried her grief and her private history under layers of dignity and discretion, and the relentless forward motion that survival in the royal world requires, said, "Yes, it is." The guard by the door would later say that what struck him in that moment was not what was said, but how it was said. He had spent years hearing members of the royal family speak. He had heard them in official settings and private ones, in moments of public performance and genuine private exchange. He knew the difference by that point between the voice a royal uses when they are performing and the voice they use when they are not. And in those 2 words, Yes, it is, he heard something he had not heard before. He heard a woman who was not performing. He heard someone simply telling the truth. The conversation ended shortly after, because a member of staff did what members of staff in royal households are trained to do when situations need to be managed. She entered the room with a quiet, manufactured purpose, and gently collected Louis with the practiced warmth of someone who has spent years making exits feel natural rather than engineered. Louis went without protest, turning once at the door to look back at Camilla with the particular backward glance of children who are not yet done with something, but accept, provisionally, that now is not the time. And then he was gone. The room held for a moment the particular atmosphere that a room holds after something significant has happened in it, a kind of charged stillness, the air slightly different, the ordinary objects in it carrying a new weight. The people who remained looked at each other and then, carefully, away from each other, and Camilla looked at the window, just the window. The pale winter sky beyond it, the bare trees, the familiar grounds of a palace that had been her home and her prison and her redemption, and her life's great complicated story all at once. Nobody spoke for a while. There was nothing to say that would have been appropriate, and the people in that room understood this. They were professionals. They would manage what they had witnessed with the discretion their positions required. But they were also human beings, and what they had just seen had moved them in the way that genuine things move people, not dramatically, not with tears or exclamations, but quietly and permanently. They would carry it. What they carried, as the days that followed slowly unfolded, was not just the memory of what had been said. It was the understanding of what it meant. Because the two words Camilla had said to Louis, "You're right," opened a question that the palace household had never been required to formally consider before. Not because the underlying rumor was new. It was not new. It was old. It had been circulating in various forms since the 1970s, appearing in books and whisper networks and the occasional tabloid insinuation, always denied officially, always surviving unofficially. But it had never, until now, been confirmed by the person at its center, even in this limited, indirect way, even in a conversation with a child that she might reasonably expect to remain private. Even in two words that could theoretically be interpreted as something other than what they appeared to be. The senior household staff understood, with the clarity that comes from long experience in environments where words are weighed and consequences are calculated, that what Camilla had said was not ambiguous. She had said it plainly to a child who asked plainly, and the plainness was itself significant. It was the answer of someone who was tired of the alternative, who had spent 50 years giving the alternative, silence, deflection, the managed non-response, and who, in the presence of a child's uncalculated honesty, had simply run out of the energy required to continue. This is what long secrets do to the people who carry them. This is something that the household staff, some of whom had been in royal service long enough to have seen other secrets and other people carrying them, understood instinctively. Secrets do not become easier with time. They become heavier. The weight does not distribute or diminish. It accumulates. And there comes a moment, sometimes in a grand and deliberate way, sometimes in a small and accidental way, in a private sitting room on a December morning with a child who walked through the wrong door, when the person carrying the weight simply puts it down. Not because they chose to, exactly, but because the specific combination of moment and person in question was the one that their strength was finally insufficient against. In the days following the encounter, several things happened quietly and simultaneously. The junior assistant who had been present as an accidental witness was spoken to by a senior member of staff in the careful, formal way that palace households handle sensitive information, not threateningly, but clearly. She was reminded of the nature of her position, the discretion it required, the trust that was foundational to everything. She nodded. She understood. She had, if anything, already arrived at this understanding on her own because the palace household does not employ people who need to be told twice about discretion. The guard who had been by the door had a similar conversation. He was older, more experienced, and his conversation was briefer because less needed to be said. He had been in service long enough to know the difference between information that belonged to the world and information that belonged to the people it concerned. This, he had already decided, belonged to the people it concerned. The senior members of staff who had been in the room faced a slightly different calculation. They were not simply witnesses. They were people with institutional responsibilities. They reported to household leadership in ways that the junior staff did not. And what they had witnessed was not, This was the question they turned over carefully, a security matter, or a protocol breach, or anything that fell clearly within the categories their professional obligations were designed to address. It was something more human than any of their job descriptions encompassed. One of them, a woman who had worked in the royal household for over 2 decades, went home that evening and sat in her kitchen for a long time without turning on a light. Her husband asked if she was all right. She said yes. She made dinner. She talked about ordinary things. And somewhere inside her, she placed what she had witnessed in the place where people who work in royal households place the things they see that are not theirs to carry further. She placed it carefully, with respect for what it was, and she left it there. Back in the palace in the apartments of the Prince and Princess of Wales, another quiet unfolding was taking place. Louis, as children do, had mentioned his mourning. Not all of it. Children rarely give complete accounts of things they do not fully understand, but enough. He had mentioned seeing Camilla. He had mentioned that they had talked. He had mentioned, with the matter-of-fact brevity of childhood, something of what they had talked about. Catherine, who had been listening to her youngest child with the practiced attention of a mother who has learned that the things children say offhandedly are often the things that matter most, had gone very still. She had asked, with the careful calm of a parent trying not to project alarm onto a child, a few gentle questions. Louis had answered them with the patient tolerance of a child who is not sure why adults ask the same question several different ways, but is willing to answer it again. And Catherine had excused herself and found William. The conversation between William and Catherine about what Louis had done would remain, naturally, entirely private. But what is known, because it became visible in the days that followed in the adjustments to household routines, in the slightly different quality of the interactions between the Wales family and the Camilla side of the household, is that William had also gone very still when he heard what Louis had said, and that he had stayed very still for a while. And that whatever he felt in that stillness, whether it was anger or grief or something more complicated that did not have a clean name, he had chosen in the end to handle it in the private, controlled way that he handles most things that cost him something. Because this was not simply a story about a child walking through a wrong door. For William, this was personal in a way that had nothing to do with palace protocol and everything to do with the long, complicated inheritance of growing up as the son of Charles and Diana. The rumor that Louis had stumbled into was not new to him. He had known of it in the vague, half-examined way that you know things that you have decided, for your own sanity, not to fully examine, for years. It was part of the landscape of his parents' story, one more shadow in a terrain already full of shadows. He had largely left it there, in the landscape, unexamined. And now his 6-year-old son had walked through a door and asked the question directly, and received something that amounted to a confirmation, and brought it home in his coat pocket like a stone he had found interesting without knowing it had edges. William was not angry at Louis. This is something those close to the family were clear about, in the careful way that people close to the family are sometimes clear about things obliquely in the spaces between what they say. Louis was 6. Louis had done what 6-year-olds do, which is engage with the world honestly and directly, and without the filters that adults spend their entire lives constructing. Nobody was angry at Louis. But the question of how Louis had known, how a 6-year-old had come to be in possession of even the outline of a rumor that most adults in public life have the sense to manage carefully, was a question that William was sitting with. Carefully, because it meant that someone, somewhere in the private circles of their family life, had spoken about this within earshot of a child. Had said enough, in the way adults sometimes do when they believe children are occupied or sleeping or simply too young to absorb what they are hearing, for the child to absorb it. And the question of who that was, not in a punitive sense, but in the deepest, most private sense of a man who has spent his life learning which people around him he can truly trust, was something William would be living with for considerably longer than a December morning. What happens to a secret when it is no longer entirely a secret? This is not a philosophical question. It is a practical one, and it is the question that everyone touched by what happened in that sitting room was quietly grappling with in the weeks that followed. The information had not changed. Camilla's past had not changed. But the container holding that past had developed a crack, small, visible only to a handful of people, but a crack nonetheless. And the existence of the crack changed things in ways that could not be entirely predicted or controlled. For Camilla, the days after the encounter with Louis were externally indistinguishable from any other days. She continued to fulfill her public engagements with the composure that defines her public self. She attended official events, appeared in photographs, carried out the duties that her position required of her with the quiet professionalism that has characterized her approach to royal life from the beginning. Nothing in her public presentation suggested that anything had shifted. This was expected. This was what she did. The management of private reality beneath the surface of public performance is the foundational skill of royal existence, and Camilla had learned it more thoroughly than most. But those who worked closely with her in those weeks noticed things that were small enough to be deniable but too consistent to be accidental. She was quieter in the mornings than usual. Not withdrawn. She was never withdrawn. Her warmth with staff was one of the things that those who worked with her most consistently cited as genuine and not performed, but quieter in a way that suggested she was carrying more internal weight than usual. She sometimes paused in the middle of tasks in a way that was unusual for a woman of her decisiveness. She looked at certain things, a window, a garden, a photograph on a shelf, for slightly longer than she needed to. She was, in the private opinion of the woman who had worked beside her for over 2 decades, thinking about something. Not worrying about it exactly. Worry implies a forward-facing anxiety, and this felt more backward-facing, more like the contemplation of something already done or already decided. She was revisiting something, sitting with it, turning it over in the way that people turn over things they have spent a long time not turning over, once the act of not turning them over has become too costly to maintain. The rumor itself, the one that Louis had stumbled into, the one about the child, was old enough to have its own complicated history separate from whatever the truth of it was. It had emerged in various forms at various moments over the preceding 5 decades, and each time it had emerged, it had been managed in the same way. Through silence, through the complete absence of official comment, through the implicit understanding that the palace would not dignify speculation with a response, and that the silence was its own kind of denial even when it was not. What gave the rumor its particular durability was not any single piece of evidence. It was the quality of the absence of evidence, the very completeness of the official silence, the very thoroughness with which certain questions had been rendered unanswerable, that kept the conversation alive in the minds of people who cover the royal family and people who simply pay attention to it. When everything is addressed except one thing, the unaddressed thing becomes the most interesting thing in the room. And for 50 years, in the conversation about Camilla Parker Bowles, there was one thing that was never addressed. There were books, there were researchers. There were people who had been in London in the early 1970s and who had things they remembered, things they chose not to speak about publicly but spoke about privately, in the careful way that people speak about things they believe to be true but cannot prove. There were medical records that did not exist where they should have existed, according to some who had looked, and the absence of records is itself a form of information in environments where records are carefully kept. There were whispers from people who had known Camilla then, as a young woman, before the palace, before the public scrutiny, who said things that were never printed but were never entirely forgotten either. None of this was proof, all of it was noise. And in royal coverage, noise is easy to dismiss, and the palace had long been expert at the dismissal of noise. What the palace could not have anticipated in any of the 5 decades during which it maintained its management of this particular silence was a 6-year-old with a question and a woman who was tired. In the weeks after the encounter, a conversation took place between William and his father, the king, that those aware of its existence described only in the most general terms. It was not, by any account, a dramatic confrontation. William does not do dramatic confrontations. It is one of the ways in which he and Harry are most fundamentally different people. It was a quiet conversation, private. The kind of conversation between a father and a son that has layers of history underneath, it making every word heavier than it would be in a simpler relationship. The kind of conversation where what is said is less significant than what is understood, and what is understood is less significant than the fact that it was said at all. The king, for his part, was not unaware of what had happened. In a household the size of a royal palace, very little happens without the principals eventually becoming aware of it, even when the people around them are doing everything professionally possible to manage information carefully. He had known about the encounter. He had known what Camilla had said. And he had, by all accounts, sat with that knowledge in his own particular way before the conversation with William occurred. Those who have watched Charles over the decades, who have tried to understand him as a human being beneath the institution, have often noted that he is a man with an unusual capacity for holding contradictions. He can hold love and duty simultaneously. He can hold grief and acceptance. He can hold the knowledge of having caused damage and the genuine desire to repair what he can within the constraints of who he is. Whether this capacity represents wisdom or avoidance depends largely on who is doing the assessment. But it is real, and it was visible in how he navigated the weeks after what Louis had done, with a stillness that those around him interpreted not as indifference, but as the particular stillness of someone sitting very carefully with something very heavy. The conversation he had with William was, by the accounts of those tangentially aware of it, not about the rumor itself. It was not a conversation where things that had never been said were finally said explicitly. It was more a conversation about what comes next, about how a family that is also an institution manages information that has shifted without officially shifting, about what obligations, if any, had been created by Camilla's two-word response to a child's honest question, and about what William needed, not as a prince, not as a future king, but as a son who had spent his life navigating the private costs of his parents' complicated history, to feel that he had been seen by his father. Whether Charles gave him that, whether the conversation provided what William needed from it, is not something that has been, or likely will be, reported. But what can be observed is that in the weeks after the conversation, the dynamic between William and his father did not visibly deteriorate. There was not the kind of cold distance that appears between them when something has gone badly wrong. There was something more like a tenuous, mutual acknowledgement. Two people who share a vast inheritance of complication deciding, for now, to hold it together rather than separately. For Louis, life continued in the way that life continues for 6-year-olds regardless of the significance of what they have said or done. He went back to school. He played. He argued with his siblings in the particular inventive way that the youngest child of 3 argues, deploying unexpected logic and sudden retreats with equal tactical confidence. He did not seem troubled by what had happened, which is both the mercy and the mystery of childhood, that it can hold genuinely significant events without being deformed by them, at least in the short term. His mother watched him in the weeks that followed with the particular attention of a parent who knows that something has happened and is trying to understand the shape of its effect on her child. Catherine is someone who has spoken, publicly and with genuine feeling, about the importance of emotional awareness, of giving children the language and the safety to process difficult things. She has said in various contexts that she and William are committed to raising children who can feel things without being overwhelmed by them. What she was watching for in those weeks was whether the encounter had left a mark. What she found by all observable evidence was that Louis seemed fine. He had done what he did, received a response that his 6-year-old processing had found satisfying and sad and complete, and moved on in the way that children move on not because they forget, but because their relationship to time is different from adults, and the present is always more immediately compelling than the past, even a very recent past. He had asked a question. He had gotten an answer. The answer had been sad. He had said so, and then someone had come to get him, and he had gone. But Catherine understood, because she is observant, and because she loves her children with the particular attentiveness of someone who knows what it costs to carry things alone, that what Louis had encountered would not stay at the level of a 6-year-old's comprehension forever. He would grow. He would learn more about the history of his family, through books, through things people said to him, through the gradual accumulation of understanding that comes with age in a family whose history is also, to a degree unusual even among royal families, public record. And when he was older, he would remember the woman in the sitting room, the winter light, the 2 words she had said. And he would understand, then, what he had not been able to understand at 6, the full weight of what he had stumbled into, and the full significance of what she had chosen to give him. Because what Camilla gave Louis that morning was not nothing. This is something that over time several people who were present or who came to know what happened would arrive at, that what looked in the first moment like a private crisis was also in some quieter sense a private gift. Not to the palace, not to the institution, not to the management of the story, which was not helped by any of this, but to the boy. She had told him the truth. In the careful, partial way of an adult who respects a child's capacity, she had told him something real. She had looked at him and decided that his honesty deserved honesty in return, even when that was the harder choice, even when every professional and institutional instinct she had been building for decades said otherwise. This matters because of what it says about who Camilla is beneath the role she plays. The queen consort is a performance, a necessary one, real in its way, but shaped by expectation and protocol and the specific demands of a position that is unlike any other. The woman in the sitting room that December morning was something else. She was someone who had been carrying a private grief for 50 years and who, when a child looked at her with honest eyes and asked an honest question, found that she could not give anything less than an honest answer. This is not a small thing. In the world she inhabits, honesty of this kind is not the default. It is not the safe choice. It is not the institutionally supported choice. It is a purely human choice, made in a moment of human vulnerability, and it cost her something, though precisely what it cost her is something she alone fully knows. The household staff who were present that morning did what they did with the difficult things they witnessed in their years of service. They held it. They carried it with the discretion their positions required and the care that their own humanity added to that requirement. Some of them would leave royal service in the years that followed, as staff always eventually leave, moving into other lives where the things they had witnessed faded to the status of private history. A few would remain for many more years, continuing to move through the palace corridors where things happen that the world is never supposed to know. None of them would speak publicly about what they saw that morning. This story has been assembled from fragments, from the careful, oblique accounts of people who were there, from the visible evidence of how the people involved behaved in the aftermath, from the understanding that comes from watching powerful people navigate powerful things over a long period of time. It is not a complete story. Complete stories are rare in the world of royalty, because completion requires disclosure, and disclosure requires a willingness to be seen fully, and full visibility is precisely what the institution is designed to prevent. But it is a true story in the ways that matter, in the truth of a boy who asked a question because he did not yet know you weren't supposed to, in the truth of a woman who answered because she was tired of not answering, in the truth of a family that carries its history the way all families carry history, imperfectly, painfully, with love underneath the difficulty and difficulty underneath the love. In the truth of people who stand in rooms watching history happen and who feel it, despite everything, because they are human beings before they are anything else. Prince Louis will grow up. He will become, one day, a young man who understands fully what happened in that sitting room on a December morning when he was 6. He will understand what Camilla carried and what she gave him. He will understand why the room went so quiet, and why nobody knew what to say, and why the guard by the door did not step forward when every instinct told him to. He will understand the weight of those 2 words and what it took to say them. And perhaps this is the hope of the people who were there, the private hope that a few of them carried with them into their own lives. He will remember it not as the moment he said something he shouldn't have, but as the moment a woman decided that honesty mattered more than protection. The moment a 6-year-old's question did what 50 years of public scrutiny had not managed to do. It reached through the layers of composure and performance and institutional armor and found at the center a person. Just a person, tired and honest and real. In royal life, that is the rarest thing of all.